Well, welcome. My name is Jen Busa. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. And thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn, Slavery, Sin, and Capital Punishment in 18th Century Connecticut. Our presenter today is Arrannè Rispoli, a PhD candidate at the Department of History at UCLA, where he is writing his dissertation entitled The Justice of Malicious Intent, Capital Punishment, and the origins of Black criminality in early New England. His work has been supported by the Omohundro Institute, the Rhode Island Historical Society, the Folger Shakespeare Library, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and 4 institutions as part of the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium, including the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. And Arrannè was here a few months ago during research, so we're really excited to hear about the project. So welcome, Arrannè.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Are you good for me to go? Jen, can you hear me? We're all
Yep,
good?
we're all
Okay.
good. Thanks.
Fantastic. Okay. Um, okay. Now, once I can get this to go, there we go. Okay.
We're good to go. Thank you. Perfect.
All right. Can everybody hear me? I hope so. If not, I'm sure I'll see the chat blown up or Jen will. But yeah, thank you very much for coming. I'm sure that it's a busy time for people with family obligations and work obligations and whatnot. But I appreciate you spending your lunchtime with me during a holiday week, and I wish you all happy holidays. So this is, as Jen alluded to, a preview of what my dissertation will be on, the topic of my dissertation, which is on this relationship between slavery or servitude, sin, criminality, capital punishment in colonial New England. But because I had spent some time, 3 weeks at the Connecticut Historical Society, formerly the Connecticut Historical Society, but now Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. Um, I wanted to tailor this talk with Connecticut in mind specifically, but as I was going through and designing the talk, it became a little bit expanded and broader and broader. And so I hope that I've brought it back in. To anchor us, I'm going to start with uh, two major case studies. Um, Two enslaved Africans who were executed, Jack and Hannah. So Jack is executed in 1681 and Hannah is executed in 1731. Jack is not executed in Connecticut, but he is from Connecticut. Hannah is executed in Connecticut. And so I'll bookend the talk with them in mind. Um, but uh, I will, in the middle of the talk, get into some theology and law and try to make it as painless as possible, both for me and for you. But uh, for those who are maybe more familiar with this topic than others, or even if you're not, like because I am in this process of writing the dissertation, I'm really excited to hear what you have for me, thoughts that you have, and maybe suggestions as well would be excellent and welcome. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Okay, so my voice, sorry, I'm battling a cold, but I think I'll be okay. My thanks to Jen, of course, for facilitating this and inviting me to the talk. And then also everybody who made my 3 weeks at the Historical Society excellent. Rebecca, Kiana, Sarah, Andrea, and of course, Sierra Dixon, director. So I really appreciate it very much. Um, so between 1675 and 1775, some context. That's the scope of my dissertation. 1675 to 1775. New England executed enslaved Africans at the highest per capita rate of any British American colony. 16.8 executions per 100,000 people, which is nearly 4 times the rate in the southern colonies of Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, which combine for 4.17 per 100,000 people. And it's an even higher average than Barbados, which is 13.3 people per year per 100,000 people. This is just an opening to give you some context to say that New England's executions in total, we only have about 3 dozen enslaved Africans who are executed in the history of New England. And when you look at that number, you might be led to believe that capital punishment and slavery as a duality, but also individually, was not significant or was not a significant aspect of the legal system or the social landscape, political landscape, and so on. Um, and of course, extrapolating these numbers to do averages, there's problems with that. So this is not to say that New England's system of execution or, a system of enslavement, we're not doing tit for tat comparisons of brutality of enslavement and executions and whatever. But again, it's just to situate ourselves and maybe to surprise some of us who might not have thought of New England as having that role in designing the landscape of capital punishment. I believe that New England was unique in that it maintained a single set of capital statutes for its entire colonial period. And in principle, at least, these capital statutes did not distinguish between race, freedom status, gender, religion, or so on. Okay, this makes New England unique across all of British North America and, of course, the British Caribbean as well, even Pennsylvania. So at the turn of the 18th century, Pennsylvania even goes to a racialized system of capital punishment, insofar that there is a separate list of capital statutes for enslaved Africans and than there are for free whites or indentured whites, and so on. So New England is unique in that respect. And I am curious to know how this sort of quasi or early form of a colorblind system, if you will, is working at this time, and how is it being negotiated? How does it come to being formed? What are the various contradictions at play in New England? And I am starting from the understanding that New England, as Francis Bremer or was it Francis Bremer? Maybe I might be misattributing it, but New Englanders are people who tried to do right in a world where they did wrong, something to that effect, right? And I think that that really captures the essence of New England's capital punishment. So, um, what you see on the screen is a timeline of events of where we'll begin my talk, which is there's a freedom suitcase in Boston at the turn of the 18th century. And New England as a region, New Englanders are very proud that New England is the first region, along with Pennsylvania, the first colonies, to establish gradual emancipation, right? Quock Walker and Elizabeth Freeman, that's in 1783. And, Connecticut also establishes gradual emancipation in 1784. So we're looking at an early freedom suit in 1700, okay? In 1700, the Bristol-based merchant and probate justice John Saffin became embroiled in a highly publicized freedom suit with his enslaved man Adam. Among the loudest commentators was Samuel Sewall, also a prominent legal and political figure in Massachusetts Bay, who published an anti-slavery tract titled The Selling of Joseph. Sewell cited biblical precedent, law, and the personhood of the enslaved population in his polemic. Saffin soon responded to Sewell in a tract of his own, defending the institution of slavery and also employing religion, legal doctrine, and the inner qualities of enslaved Africans, though, of course, for vastly different effect. Looking to Saffin's views on the latter category, consider his poetic conclusion of his tract, A Brief and Candid Answer, which he signposts with this heading, quote, The Negro's Character. Quote, cowardly and cruel are those blacks innate, prone to revenge and inveterate hate, mischief and murder in their very eyes. Mischief and murder in their very eyes. So this is a defense of slavery, and he's using this language of criminality as a defense of slavery. So I take this as a jumping off point to tell you about my project a little bit more, and later Connecticut specifically. But, in this project, I examine people like John Saffin. I examine the vocabulary that people like John Saffin and other legal authorities, but also lay people, magistrates, and enslaved Africans themselves in defense of themselves. But I examine how New Englanders at this time employed what I see as a vocabulary of criminality and criminal intent. And I'll explain what that means later. But a vocabulary of criminality and criminal intent that emerges from a forum of early modern discourse concerning British common law, the development of British common law. So I see phrases such as, quote, mischief and murder in their very eyes as a deliberate invocation of legal and theological vocabularies. Saffin's rhetoric represents a conscious fusion between culturally legible ideas of what will become known in the 17th century as malice aforethought, or what we would recognize today as criminal intent, with innate evil or theological sin or delinquency. And taking these ideas of criminal intent and innate evil, I believe that Saffin and others map these concepts onto the physical appearance of enslaved Africans to render the construction of the archetypical black criminal. So, phrases that Saffin and others employ, I believe, justify some sort of preemptive moral and legal judgment that racializes and naturalizes the supposed criminality of the enslaved. And so, with this, and it'll become more clear, I promise, as I move through the talk, but with this, I'm trying to move away from this sort of reduction of black criminality equals black skin, racialization equals some sort of corporality. And of course, the material effects of racialization, the actual in material and the pain and the suffering that skin sort of facilitates, right? That's real. I'm not denying that. But what I want to sort of get underneath, I want to see the mechanics of how these thoughts come to be. I don't think that there is anything, and this is obvious, right? I don't think that there is anything natural or inherent about black criminality and those two concepts together, blackness and criminality. However, in this process, it does come to be and come to be constructed in the colonial imaginary as two um, objects of discourse for colonial New Englanders and in the British Atlantic more generally. So, as leading magistrates in countless criminal trials, both Sewell and Saffin were fluent in language that derived from mens rea, which originates in English common law. And my dissertation explores the role of mens rea in constructing the archetype of the black criminal. And mens rea is a legal concept that remains at the core of Anglo-American legal philosophy today. But mens rea can be attributed to Sir Edward Coke in the 17th century. In his seminal legal text in the 17th century, Sir Edward Coke asserts the primacy of mentality and the mind in determining a criminal's culpability, stating, quote, "The act does not punish the guilty unless the mind is guilty. The act does not punish the guilty unless the mind is guilty." So if you're looking at this order of or this timeline of sorts that I made, we're looking for Edward Coke around number 4. So he is building on a tradition that's actually thousands of years long before him. Okay. But Edward Coke develops what is mens rea, which then makes it into Anglo-American law and then eventually the United States Criminal Code, and still today. So my project asks, how did historical actors at this time come to configure the mind as separate from the body? And so to answer this question in relation to my topic of slavery and capital punishment, I mine the archive, the what would be called like a social history archive, um, to sort of collate a comprehensive list of adjectives used by courts, but also lay people and religious authorities to describe capital crimes. So I'm looking not only at legal documents, which makes up what has most legal scholars tend to use is the court documents themselves. And of course, that's a good starting point. But I'm also looking to see how are these individuals describing enslaved Africans in the letters and the diaries and the probates and the merchant ledgers and so on, and to see if there's overlap between how they're described in the criminal record and how they're described in the day-to-day record. Um, so it's within this context of legal, racial, and political transformations that I present the principle of mens rea as a legal mechanism by which racial presuppositions stemming from the transatlantic slave trade collated into an intelligible archetype of Black criminality. Um, so I argue that mens rea and African slavery produced this vocabulary, co-created this vocabulary, and that language was the mediating tool that harmonized the psyche of Anglo-Americans with their material realities. So the lexicon of what we see describing Black crimes in the archive, Black designs, vengeful slaves, quote, plotting Negroes. I believe that words like these and phrases like these form cultural presuppositions that were supported by verifiable, dubiously, but verifiable examples of enslaved Africans convicted of capital crimes. A court's conviction of an enslaved African in New England carried more weight, I believe, than elsewhere in the British Atlantic because of what I mentioned earlier, which is that New England is the only region that did not distinguish their capital statutes by race. And so it gives the system of adjudication, the system of law and law enforcement, um, it gives it a gloss of justness, of fairness. And while some scholars have looked at that and looked at New England to say, well, that helps alleviate sort of the suffering of bondage, of human bondage. Um, I think that it has a very subtle, pernicious effect over time. And that's what my project seeks to explore. So um, I'm going to move to my first case study. And this case study takes place in September 1681, but the crime itself takes place in the summer of 1681. So as summer turned to fall in the final weeks of September 1681, a sizable audience that at least one account estimated to number into the thousands traveled to the site where two enslaved Africans, Maria and Jack, were scheduled to be publicly executed. Both Maria and Jack had been accused, convicted, and sentenced by the Massachusetts Bay courts for allegedly setting fire to two homes in Massachusetts that July. Although rumors circulated of a broader slave conspiracy, there was no evidence to suggest that Maria and Jack had acted together. Nor does it appear that they knew of one another before they met. Even still, Maria and Jack had acted. Even still, Maria and Jack had each been deemed guilty by a 12-person jury of their peers. Now, the fact that enslaved Africans had guaranteed access to jury trials from the very beginning um, suggests suggests that New England has another element of uniqueness in their criminal procedures. So not only are enslaved Africans held to purportedly the same capital statutes as whites, but when they are accused and charged for said capital crime, they are privileged with a 12-person jury also. But of course, we know and we can surmise at least that a 12-person jury of their peers, which is language borrowed from England, of their peers, the jury trial of England that was a procedural hallmark that by the 15th century had become a standard right for all free English subjects. That Maria and Jack were neither free nor English, yet were nonetheless able to stand trial, was a cruel irony unique to the experience of African and indigenous bondspeople accused of committing capital offenses in New England. There have only been a handful of instances where indigenous jurors served on the jury for capital trials. There was never an instance where an enslaved African or a free African served on the jury. So the idea that they could be a jury of peers, right? Of course, there are some problems with that. Nevertheless, mutually afflicted by this legal system, the lives of Maria and Jack converge once more on September 22nd when they were executed in Boston. And so right here is just the confession of Maria, and it gets cut off, but towards the bottom, towards the right side of the document, you'll see a little scratch that is supposed to be Maria's mark of her confession. And so what ends up happening is that the examiner, writes their confession and then Maria signs it. In my project, of course, there are many ways that a historian, myself, or others can problematize this system, but that's just to give you an example of the process of adjudication. So I want to talk to you about Jack because Jack is our Connecticut connection. Okay, um, Jack, his fire happens. The fire that he's accused of happens 3 days later. Okay. And in Jack's case, the fire began at night around the same time, 3 days later in mid-July. But Jack had been enslaved in Connecticut. He had run away and found himself in Northampton where the fire took place. So, how did Jack get there? Why was Jack in Northampton? Jack later testified that he had been on the run for a little over a week at that point, having chosen fugitivity over bondage after the latest of his master's abuses. His enslaver, Samuel Wolcott, was a Connecticut merchant based out of Wethersfield. And it is from Wolcott's account book in the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History manuscript collection that I am now able to offer new insights into the circumstances of Jack's offense and his personhood. So, my idea with this is to briefly sort of bring you through my process, my methodology. Um, so, I looked through the legal documents to see what executions took place and who was put on trial for capital crimes. Once you find a name, and unfortunately, enslaved Africans, as some of you might know, like many don't come are written into the record with a last name. So often it's very difficult to track them into the archive. But the great thing, if I can use that word, it doesn't feel right, but the thing that makes my research possible, I should say, is that any crime has a tracing of victims, has a tracing of quote unquote culprits, has a tracing of like location and witnesses and any number of possibilities. And so in the legal document, which I don't have pictured here, uh, the legal document says that the enslaved man is Jack, who is property of Samuel Wolcott. And so during my research at in Connecticut, I searched for any trace of a Wolcott. And the Wolcotts, if you're from the area, the Wolcotts are a very famous family. You might recognize the name. An elder Wolcott becomes Secretary of Treasury for John Adams, and there's three governors in the family, and there are multiple justices and sheriffs, deputies, and so on. And so it's a very esteemed family in Connecticut. So I was very fortunate to find Samuel Wolcott's account book. Okay, Samuel Wolcott being the enslaver of Jack. So what do I find here? Jack had run away that night to set this fire in Northampton, but he had also run away twice before. So what you see pictured here is Samuel Wolcott documenting two instances where he had to pay out the reward for somebody returning Jack to his possession. Okay. And so in Jack's testimony in the legal documents, he talks about the abuses that he suffered at the hands of his master. And now we not only have the third instance of him running away, but we have a precedent. We have him running away twice before. And so over a period of 3 years, he runs away three times. And so we can only begin to imagine, how desperate Jack might have been to have run away three times. Okay. So the person that Jack chooses for the house that Jack chooses to set on fire is very interesting. It's very interesting for this reason. Jack's case has been written about a few times before. However, the person's the person that owns the house that Jack sets on fire is Lieutenant William Clark of Northampton. Okay. Northampton is about 50 miles away from the Wolcott residence in Wethersfield, Connecticut. And Jack says that he entered the home of William Clark searching for food because, again, he had been on the run. And while he was sifting through the Clark family pantry with one hand and lighting his way with a hearth fire stick with the other, the fire stick lit something nearby that was flammable and then set the house on fire soon thereafter. Okay. Scholars who have previously written about Jack's story have not made a connection between William Clark and Jack. Jack claims that there was no ill will towards William Clark, but there were rumors that William Clark had done him wrong. But it was hard to substantiate those rumors, and so historians had not pursued it before. But what you find in Samuel Wolcott's account book is very interesting, and it's interesting for this reason. There is a connection between Samuel Wolcott and William Clark going back to 1678, 3 years before the fire. Jack, as you look through the account book, and of course, I don't have the time to include everything, but as you look through the account book, you see that Jack is being leased out by Samuel Wolcott a lot. And he's being leased out to none other than to William Clark, in addition to other people. And so what I have here is the beginning of a relationship between William Clark and Jack. And so what does this add to how we understand Jack's crime? Just seeing the Samuel Wolcott's account book. I believe that it's very significant that, as I said, Jack flees not once, not twice, but 3 times. If you only look at the legal document instead of going in search for something like an account book, you would only know about the one time that he fled. Jack's courageous efforts to secure his freedom are revealed in the receipts documenting payments. Although each escape was short-lived, recognizing Jack's repeated attempts to break free from Samuel Wolcott's hold helps restore aspects of his humanity that challenge the flat categorizations of Jack as enslaved, criminal, and condemned. Lastly, I believe that Samuel Wolcott's daybook indicates that he leased Jack's labor out on several occasions, including to William Clark. Now, why this is important is read in the context of Jack's conviction for setting fire to Clark's home. Regardless of whether the fire was accidental or, as the courts insisted, was done wittingly, quote, and quote, feloniously, it becomes clear that Jack strategically selected the Clark domicile in Northampton. Now, you could look at that and say he strategically set the fire, but I would venture to guess that he knew his way around the home. And if you are an enslaved person who is trying to secure freedom for yourself and you are in need of victuals, perhaps you would go to a home where you knew your way around the pantry, where you knew where things were located, because you had worked there before. And although it's not clear, of course, what Jack's motivations were, and it's not necessarily the historian to try to figure that out, we at least know this. Jack's route to Northampton, ending up 50 miles away from his residence in Wethersfield, was not arbitrary. It was not a matter of chance. It was not a decision born of convenience, but it was a shrewd calibration based on Jack's intimate knowledge of Northampton and the Clark home that he had acquired in years past. So, basically my goal with this is to just extend enslaved Africans who are frozen in time in legal documents as being condemned, convicted, executed, as permanently enslaved, permanently dead, flattened as a human. And, as many details as one could extract, I think adds to the context of the case itself. Okay. So I just want to take us through a little bit of where mens rea comes from and criminal intent. Now that we have some idea of what this means, and also we have a case to anchor it to, because this is, I believe, the sort of legal knowledge and environment of legal knowledge that the jurors are making their decisions, and the justices and the constables, the legal apparatus of New England, they're operating under these operative assumptions of criminal intent, mens rea, and so on. Okay. So just as a survey, I provided what the capital crimes through the time of Connecticut. Okay. So the first comprehensive code, capital statutes for Connecticut is in 1642. Now, I put an asterisk next to all of the statutes that are all the crimes that have biblical precedent. Okay. And biblical precedent is marked usually, especially this early on, with a direct reference to the scripture. Um, so 11 out of 12 have direct biblical precedent in Connecticut. Okay. Now, if we go to 1650, these are the capital crimes that were added. So it's the same list here, but now with these additional crimes. And these additional crimes, all of them, except for burglary and robbery being a third offense, the so-called three-strike rule, has biblical precedent also. And so we see the colony embracing religion more in their capital statutes, not less, between 1642 and 1650. In 1673, only adultery is eliminated from the capital statute. Incest and arson are added to the capital statute. 1702, 1715, 1784, we have these additions of conspiracy. Infanticide is now considered its own crime and not considered willful homicide as before, and so on. And you can glance 1784, destroying war material coming out of the context of the American Revolution. That makes sense. And so the reason I wanted to show you these laws, and I know I'm not going into great detail about any one crime, but what you should notice here is a pattern that crimes expand and contract based on what's happening in the society at the time. It's a mirror of sorts. And so what the researcher could do, or the curious a history buff could do, could go back and look and see what's happening at this time, where now arson is a guaranteed capital crime, and incest is a standard capital crime. And in doing so, I think that a lot of interesting aspects come about. So mens rea, just very briefly, Protestantism, the Catholic influence in Protestant North America, particularly in New England, is not well appreciated. But at least in this concept of mens rea, it does have its origins in the writings of Aquinas. It does have its origins in the moral evaluation, the internal intentional meditations of the Jesuits. It has also its origins in the concept of the Roman dolus within Christian moral psychology. The Roman dolus being a level of intent, a level of harm that one does that the Romans use to describe a crime that one does. Um, and what we see beginning in the early medieval, working up through Edward Coke, as I mentioned, is that English common law emerged in this really dynamic environment over hundreds of years at its core, from the late medieval to the early modern, but thousands of years before that. And it coalesces and coheres the theology, the theology, English common law, and the social needs and pressures of the environment all coalesce to establish what looks like a legal code or a legal statute. And so this is all to say that there is nothing naturally forming about law in this time period, or I would say any time period. And so when we're looking at those who are convicted of capital crimes, we're not doing so to relitigate whether or not they did the crime, but we're looking to see if what the crime is and what its significance is and what it means to that society to begin with. We're challenging it at the very fundamental level of the act itself. Uh, so I would like to finish in 1731 now. And I know I've gone really quickly. And so I'm going to just finish this with this final case study for questions, leave room for questions and comments. But we started with the 1700 freedom suit, John Saffin using a language of criminal intent to justify slavery. Okay. That was not a capital crime, but we have the language that is used in capital offenses and capital adjudication. 1681, Jack, and the context that surrounds Jack. Now I just want to read you or go through really quickly this 1631 or 1731 case that happens in Connecticut. So Hannah is an enslaved woman in the house of Moses Atwater. Okay. And in Moses Atwater's house, there are two female apprentices, Jamina Beecher and Hannah Merriman. So we have, as an example, tiers of unfreedom in New England, and this does exist, right? I mean, the common rebuttal maybe that certain detractors will say is, well, weren't there white slaves, or weren't there this or that, right? Um, and though we don't have time to get into why that's problematic and also inaccurate, but we can say that even outside the definition of slavery, there are gradations of unfreedom, as Jared Hardesty wrote in his book that is titled Unfreedom. So that sets up for a dynamic that's very interesting in the legal context. Because what we see is that even though all three of these women are technically unfree, although gradations of unfree, in the legal context, it is Hannah, who is enslaved, who is not offered the full protection of the law, or let's say the generous assessment of the law as her counterparts, Jamina and Hannah are. And you'll see what I mean. So we have a few witness accounts. The first bullet point is from the coroner's inquest. And we have a testimony of a description of the scene of the crime. So Hannah apparently stabs the woman, okay, in the middle of the night in their sleep, lying in gore of blood, being stabbed by a mortal weapon in the throat, and by a testimony of Moses Atwater and his wife, who heard a screaming in the night. He went up and found said Beecher bleeding of said wound and expiring, and said Atwater found his Negro woman in the chamber with said Beecher, etc., etc. Okay, sharp knife, bloody, sets a real scene. Okay. Um, Now, the coroner's inquest is read to the grand jurors, and the grand jurors are the one that decide whether or not to indict Hannah. Now, we can establish, even from this sample, the difference between what the crime is on what is fact. Hannah stabbed so and so. Hannah stabbed Hannah. Hannah stabbed Jamina. Now, or Jamina was lying in a gore of blood, being stabbed by a mortal weapon by the throat, etc. Okay, so we see the sensationalism at play here, even in quote unquote legalistic documents. And I'll just leave you with this image, which is the indictment in Hannah's case. So what we have is Hannah being guilty of willful murder upon malice, hatred, and cruelty. And what I found was interesting was at the bottom of the indictment, there's the sentence, okay? And it says, this court sentences Hannah, Negro, to go to the place from where she came, back to the jail, and from thence to the place of execution, and that there she shall be hanged up by the neck between heaven and earth until she be dead, dead, dead. So with the what I think is a very profound image of dead, 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 I make my final plea, which is just to say that this project is still very much coming together. As I'm writing this dissertation and finding new things all the time, and having the privilege to be at Connecticut Historical Society and elsewhere. But when we look at a legal document and we start with the dead, 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 and we start with the enslaved woman as dead, 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 and as a murderer, as full of malice and cruelty. Can we use this as a starting point instead of an end point? Can we use the gallows and the hanging as a starting point instead of an end point? And that is what I believe is my contribution, my studies contribution. And I appreciate you allowing me to tell you a little bit about it. And I look forward to any questions or comments you may have.
Thank you so much, Arrannè. That was fascinating. That's really, really quite an intricate, complex project you have. I can imagine finding more material just as complicating what you were trying to do, or how it will turn out in the end, I should say. I had a question. That last one there where it said, dead, dead, dead. Is that typical to have like such a description, or was that sort of an outlier?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we see a formalization of legal documents over the century, over the 17th and the 18th century. And so, what's interesting, you have to sort of look for any outlying aspects to it. And so, the sentencing of being brought to the place of execution and to be hanged up by the neck between heaven and earth until he or she be dead is completely standard. Dead, dead, dead. This is the first and only time I've seen this in over 200 capital executions in New England. So that is unique. And to me, it intimates some sort of a certain level of um, mm, vitriol, maybe, or like a certain urgency to execute Hannah. You know, the crime was particularly bad or offensive to those in charge, and also that's evidenced by the fact that she was executed a week later, which is fairly quick. So, yeah, thank you for that question.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If you would prefer to unmute yourself, feel free to do so. We'll give everybody a minute to type. During your visit to the Connecticut Museum. Oh, go ahead, Claudette.
Good afternoon. I noted at the beginning you gave the statistic for the prevalence of hangings or executions of Blacks. I think it was 16 for every 1,000 or 100,000.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
16.8, yep.
Yeah. So what was the percentage for whites?
Okay, so I can look that up. I have it right here. Okay, the percentage for whites in New England over the same period was 2.9. 2.9. And the percentage for indigenous New Englanders is about 6%, or six people per 100,000.
100,000, right.
Mhm.
I just wanted to get a sense as to whether or not New England was especially prone to doing executions, but it's clear that there was a racial bias or at least a racial differential. So I wanted to ask about that. And then it seems to me at the end, when you made your conclusion, basically, if I understand correctly, you said your goal was to have historians see the execution as the beginning and not the end. Did I get that right?
Yes, correct.
So, in other words, execution is a foregone conclusion. Is that what I think you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that is the nature of how, anybody who accesses these documents, you're approaching the case as if it is a foregone conclusion, because that's how the
Mm-hmm.
documents are written. And, I think that mm, there's value in thinking about uh, some brilliant scholars have done something similar to this, where they think about the crime and they basically say they relitigate it based on the
Mm-hmm.
evidence that they find.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I love that, and I think it works really well. But what I'm trying to do is to overcome this idea that we we should operate. Okay, let me know if this is clear.
Mm-hmm.
I am trying to combat the idea that we operate on a binary of criminal or non-criminal. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's extremely problematic in our time, as it was then. And so the problem I have with relitigating um, cases in the past is that if I prove, whatever that means, that they
Mm-hmm.
did not commit the crime, then that is only boosting the fact that other people are criminals, right? Or other people did commit the crime, because it's like almost
Mm.
it's legitimating the system in which criminal and non-criminals decided. So I'm trying to sort of wipe or like remove myself from that calculus altogether. I'm not sure if I'm successful or if I will be successful in doing so, but that's at least my thought process. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, I don't think I get it. One of the things you said that did resonate
Mhm.
was that if those historians who try to relitigate the crime and then find the person to have been allegedly innocent, that would mean that criminality is not solely the province of blacks and enslaved. Is that what you were saying?
Um, yes, I mean that is definitely a part of what I'm saying. Yeah, absolutely. Because you are it's in New England particularly, right? That's the unique aspect is that white and indigenous New Englanders are executed for the same crimes.
Hmm.
But I don't see that as like a gotcha, from detractors, let's say. I see that as that makes every execution of an enslaved African that much more significant. That it was not a practice of New England or really of many slave holding societies to execute enslaved Africans, right? Because they're uh, seen as property. And
Hmm.
so the fact that there is a strong sense of black criminality, I believe that New Englanders have to try, right?
Hmm.
There's a mechanical aspect. There's a practice daily, day in and day out that occurs to make this possible. And what my disappointment with some studies that look at even, let's say, in the 20th century, 21st century, carcerality, you know, we take the um, concepts, the figure of the black criminal as a given.
Hmm.
And when we say, okay, well, you know, black youths should not be criminalized for marijuana possession. That's good, right?
Hmm.
To me, it's good. But
Yeah.
it doesn't go far enough because what does it say about mm, black youths who are implicated in um, theft at a store because they look like somebody else or
Hmm.
something, right? Like
Hmm.
it's a really slippery slope, and so that's why I have trouble you know trying to make an argument based on this person is not criminal because inevitably that means that the other person is. And that other person might be, an enslaved African also. And I don't like that um, trying to find that balance. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Arrannè, we have a question. Someone is asking, where are you headed next? If you're talking about the starting point, so where do you see this project going?
Yeah. So the starting point for if we start at the gallows and then I think that there's a lot of evidence that can speak to in totality, taken as a whole. There's evidence for every enslaved African, about 3 dozen, executed in New England. Okay. And some corroborating evidence or tells us things that are really fascinating, like, they had families. And that speaks to their humanity, right? But again, and this does get to Claudette's question also. I am I really am uncomfortable with the idea that only enslaved Africans who fit this model of upstandingness or of good citizenry, has a family and was wrongly accused of a crime and implicated and so on, that they're the only ones that should be highlighted. I want to highlight them, and when I find them in the archive, that's fantastic. But I have a lot of enslaved Africans who never even got the chance to have families, who are 16 years old, 15 years old. And, maybe they are accused and convicted of what we would all agree are like extremely violent crimes. But that enslaved person committed a violent crime in a household where they were being abused. Well, that tells me not that they're a criminal, but that they are resistant. And not only resistant, but depending on how, if they use poison or if they use a particular weapon, that they're resourceful as well. And so, I guess like I can compare it to in our 21st century, we romanticize certain criminal aspects. We romanticize mafia movies. We romanticize white collar crimes in Wolf of Wall Street or something. But again, we have this sort of allergic reaction to certain kinds of criminals, and those certain kinds of criminals tend to be um, racialized also. And I don't think that's a mistake. And so I see the same thing happening in the 17th century and 18th century. And so to answer because I don't think I did, where am I going from here is just to excavate as many details as I can besides the act itself of the people who are executed in New England. And so Jack is one example that I didn't even go full into detail of, but that's sort of the possibilities that I see with all of these individuals.
Does anybody have any other questions? I'm curious as you're going along and through time to 1775 is sort of your end mark. Are you finding that there's societal factors that are at play, that why language has changed so much in describing these malicious people or bad character of these people? I'm curious how that will play into it, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I'll just leave you with this statistic that there's a lot of reforms, penal reforms, for capital punishment. A lot of New England states end up abolishing capital punishment in the 19th century. Connecticut's the last. But the rate of Black executions decreases, just like the rate of white executions and indigenous. However, the disparity between Black and white executions increases up through the 19th century. So what is that? There's a lot of interesting questions with that also. But yeah.
Well, this was really great, fascinating history. I would love to have you come back and share more of your findings when you're at the tail end of your project. But thank you so much today. This was
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you.
I do want to, go ahead. Claudette, did you have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I do this all too often. Yes, but at some point in time, did societies determine the defense, self-defense, as being something that might help to exonerate a person from being executed? Because it seems to me, as you talk, some of the slaves had been horribly treated and perhaps were not necessarily the poison, because that's premeditated, but maybe in the heat of whatever is going on, were protecting themselves. Was that ever part of the formula when decisions were made?
And thank you so much for bringing that up because that means that I did not really touch on that, and I should write that down. So that's very key to the criminal intent. Criminal intent um, takes in like mitigating factors factor into criminal intent. But what's interesting is in this study of Black criminality, what I see, uh, in addition to enslaved Africans being projected as more criminal, they're they are not protected by the law, um, vis-a-vis like these mitigating factors. So to give you an example, an enslaved, or sorry, a white person is not executed for the murder of a black victim until the 1820s in New England. Okay. So even Virginia in the 1770s has a white person, a white enslaver executed for the abuse and the murder of their enslaved person. So to answer your question, does it become part of, this calculation, I guess? Yeah, nominally so. I mean, like, but one of the goals of the project is to say just because something becomes a practice doesn't mean it's always practice, right? And it's definitely in the 18th century, because there are many enslaved Africans who are murdered by their enslavers, and their enslavers are let go, fined maybe, whipped in one instance, but never condemned to be to the gallows as they should have been by law. So no, unfortunately, not during this era.
Thank you,
But
Claudette.
I'm putting my email in there in the chat
Oh,
for Claudette or for anybody else who would like to ask questions, and I really appreciate the conversation.
well, thank you so much, Arrannè. This was really wonderful. Please, again, keep us in the loop on your progress of your project. This was fascinating. I'm just going to wrap up today and share a couple of upcoming events that we have. We have a lecture on the past and future of the American diner. Sarah Lohman is coming. She's a food historian. We've had her here before. She does a very great job. So that's a really exciting program on site on December 4th. We have a family program. It's during our first free Saturday on the 6th, getting ready for the holidays. And then our next Lunch and Learn is December 9th, Living on the Edge in New England, New Netherland, and New Sweden, looking at some border arguments between the colony of Connecticut and the Dutch colony of New Netherland. And that will be with one of our New England Regional Consortium fellows again. So we're really looking forward to the next Lunch and Learn. But you can find everything that we have going on at our website, connecticutmuseum.org. I hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving, and thank you for joining us on this busy week. And again, thank you so much, Arrannè. That was really wonderful presentation today. Thank you. Bye, everyone.